remarks are going to be. What you're seeing right now are reporters that are gathering in the room along with some of the White House advanced staff that has been prepared for this speech. We expect this speech to happen in less than 2 minutes, but it's still unclear again what the president's going to talk about. Again, we believe he will address the classified documents and the finding of the special counsel. But again, in full transparency, he could say anything tonight. We want to make sure our viewers at home know that as well. As we were saying, this is a live situation. We were just learning about this. You saw the TV bars come up. Sometimes that's going to happen when you have a live broadcast. To get you up to speed, though, if you haven't been following the news today, earlier today, the special counsel that was investigating the classified documents that were found at the private Delaware home and at the office at the Penn Center for former President Biden delivered his report to Congress and to the Attorney General. In that report, citing that he found evidence that the president willfully did disclose classified information, but that his findings, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the report in front of me, he was not going to charge the president for a variety of reasons, including he thought a jury would be sympathetic to the president who is elderly and has memory problems. In their investigations with the former president, they found the president to forget several things, if you will. Those are my words, not their words, but important things like the dates of when he was vice president, the dates of when his son had passed away. We should say in full context, this investigation, this interview happened right after the October 7th attacks in Israel. I understand that we also, and so some of the Biden aides have said that to give this context, to put this into context, the president was dealing with a lot. He was dealing with a new war in the Middle East, at the same time being questioned about things that had happened years ago. I'm being told now we have one of our White House correspondents, Ali Rafa, who's at the White House tonight for us, near the White House for us tonight. Ali, get us up to speed on what we think the president's going to talk about, because I know we just got the notification late that he's going to speak in the diplomatic room, but we're still not 100% sure what he's going to address.
Yeah, Tom, and there have been big questions over what we could see the president do next after he returned to the White House from Virginia, where he did address this special counsel report partially when he delivered remarks in front of the House Democrats. He notably did not pay any remarks to those mentions of his memory lapses and his age. He specifically just talked about how that this report would be over and how he was proud of how cooperative and communicative he had been with special counsel Hur throughout this process, as you mentioned, mentioning how the timing of his interviews that he says lasted around 5 hours, and they happened after the Israel-Hamas war began. But I think we could expect to see the same from the president when he does eventually arrive here to deliver these remarks, trying to really talk about what was accomplished through this report instead of what we have seen through those mentions of those memory lapses has been just an enormous eruption of backlash, even from Democrats within the president's own party, talking about how politically damaging this could be for the president. And remember, Tom, there were already reports that White House advisors had been concerned that this special counsel report could potentially publicly portray the president as being careless or sloppy in his handling of these classified documents. What we have come to learn out of this special counsel report is far more potentially damaging to the president and his reelection campaign because it really reinforces worries and concerns that we already have known exist. They have existed for years now, these concerns about the president's mental fitness, whether voters see him as able to carry out another term in office. And this is something that we've seen in poll after poll the president struggle with. The White House trying to flip that argument repeatedly, arguing that the president's age and experience is an advantage to this White House. So I expect to see the president making those same arguments, trying to clear the air after we have just seen this firestorm of reaction after the release of this report, Tom.
Yeah, the White House and the re-election team can deliver the rebuttal, but no doubt it was a political bombshell what the special counsel sort of put into that, indirectly involved with politics, but the way it's being perceived when poll after poll shows voters concerned with the president's age. I do want to ask you, we know that the president already addressed this. He said, quote, today, bottom line is a special counsel in my case decided against moving forward with any charges. The matter is now closed. Do we have any sense of why he's addressing this again tonight from the White House? Is it because of the political fallout?
I think that's largely the reason you're seeing this, because, I mean, I could tell you just from when the president arrived back at the White House, he ignored those questions from reporters about this report, and he made really a beeline to the Oval Office to huddle with his closest advisors. And usually the White House press corps, we rely on when the White House calls a lid, or essentially declaring that we won't hear or see any more from the president on a specific day. And when we didn't receive that after the president returned to the White House, there were questions over whether we could potentially see the president deliver these remarks, make another public appearance. And I would expect this to be largely because of this backlash that we have seen since the release of this report. Really, that reaction only growing, as we've seen not just Democrats, but also Republicans in the form of, we've even seen GOP lawmakers use this as ammunition against the president. We've seen former President Trump repeatedly post about this on his social media platforms, the campaign already putting out statements, seizing on this report and trying to use the language that Special Counsel Hur uses in this report to weaponize that and be able to use it against President Biden. So I would expect that to be largely the calculus by the White House tonight.
Ali, you said something interesting. Walk us through that timeline again, because usually people don't get sort of a look at that or sort of understand the machinations of the White House schedule. It's something that you and I maybe see a lot because, we see the president's schedule. We're privy to that. But talk to us about what the schedule said and how it changed.
Sure. So this morning, we just understood the president to, after he had, of course, his daily briefing of national security activities, we expected him to go to Leesburg, Virginia, to speak with House Democrats about essentially at their policy retreat to talk about their issues and their priorities for the year. He came back to the White House and there weren't any other activities on his schedule for the night. So there were lots of questions over what we could potentially see the president do after we didn't see, as I mentioned, the reporters and the White House call that what we call a lid, or basically a capping off of the day, a confirmation that we would not see or hear from the president after that declaration. And when we didn't receive that, there were lots of questions over what could potentially fill this empty time, what we could potentially see the president do after he returned here to the White House. And now the White House officially announcing that he will deliver these remarks. And as you mentioned before I joined you, we still cannot confirm that these remarks are in relation to this report, but that is largely the belief that these remarks will have to do and will respond to this report by Special Counsel Hur released earlier today, Tom.
And Ali, the sort of the documentation about the issues with memory come at a tough time for the president, right? Just this week, too, he's had some moments recently, speaking of foreign leaders, where he got the current foreign leaders or the foreign leaders at the time confused with European leaders who have since died.
Absolutely. This is a report that would have been damaging to any president at any time, but it comes at a time when the White House is trying to clear up these concerns and trying to spin this argument to as best as they can in their favor. And as you mentioned, there were several gaffes by the president earlier this week made during private fundraisers related to these since deceased world leaders. And that was an awkward point of conversation during even the White House press briefing today, with White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre being asked about that and whether voters' concerns about the president's age were legitimate given those gaffes that we saw earlier this week. And it was a very difficult explanation for the press secretary to have to go through. And she compared these gaffes by the president to other mistakes that other leaders and other politicians make. But a reporter in the White House press briefing today saying that those people that she did mention were significantly younger than the president, reinforcing those concerns, those worries by voters across the country, that we see in poll after poll, that the president may not be mentally fit enough to serve in a second term. And that is something that already we are seeing the Trump campaign, former President Trump, already sees on, Tom.
Ali, talk to our viewers about sort of how rare this is for this White House, right? Usually you use that phrase lid when essentially, photos, reporting is going to slow down because the president's going to retire for the night, if you will. How rare is this for this to happen at night, unplanned like this for this White House recently?
This is extremely rare, Tom. Usually we expect these surprise announcements for added remarks to happen, as we've seen in recent history, as a result of some announcement of potentially troops, perhaps U.S. troops that perhaps may have been deceased overseas or killed in something that happened overseas. And in recent history, that's the only time that we have seen these remarks pop up with this little notice. And as a White House as a whole, this is a White House that notably likes to sort of operate under what we call, quote, sort of a less is more strategy. This is a White House that keeps a very tight circle around this president, doesn't really put him out in public more than they think they need to. Very little impromptu visits and interaction with voters, interaction with just the general public. So this is a very, very rare event that these remarks would be added with such short notice, Tom.
How did the special counsel's report sort of play throughout the White House from what you were hearing? I mean, once it came down and people started to go through it, the headline at first was that obviously the president was not going to be charged. There was not going to be a trial. That wasn't going to move forward. But then the issues started coming up about what happened during his interviews, the issues and the questions surrounding his memory. When that started to come out, did the White House sort of realize what they had on their hands with this document?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because even in this report by Special Counsel Hur, there is a letter included in it from President Biden's lawyers where they sort of negate the terms, the accusations about the president's lapses in memory. I believe I have a quote from one of those here. I'll work on finding that. But they basically say that they would like to see the special counsel rewrite those mentions. They say that they are inaccurate and give an inaccurate description of the president's memory at the time. They try to justify what he said during these interviews where, as you mentioned, the president had difficulty recalling certain dates, the specific dates of when he started his term as vice president, when he ended that term, specific dates around the death of his son, Beau Biden, and several other memory lapses related to what was included in those classified documents that were found at his Wilmington, Delaware home, as well as his personal office here in Washington, D.C. So the initial reaction from the White House was actually included in this report in the form of that letter from the president's personal lawyers. But in the immediate aftermath of this being released, we did see the White House just refer to the campaign, which again is brushing off these claims by Special Counsel Robert Hur about these memory lapses in the president. They're trying to flip this argument and shift the argument, saying that the special counsel is not a doctor and is not in a place to determine the president's mental health, and that is what we've seen by large by Democrats in the aftermath of the release of this report, Tom.
Yeah, Ali, and we're just seeing the podium they're putting the final touches on there. We expect the president to walk out at any moment. If you're just joining us right now, we've been informed by the White House that President Biden is set to take that stage right there, take the podium in the diplomatic room to address something. We have not been told what. We believe he will likely talk about. He likely will talk about the classified documents, the mishandling of those classified documents, and the special counsel's report that just came out. The headline initially from that report was that the president was not going to be charged. There's going to be no trial. But then later on, as you read on, there were some aspects to what the special counsel put in that report, namely that the president had trouble remembering things, specifically his time as vice president, those years, and also the dates of when his son, Beau Biden, had died. Again, the president conducting this interview, we were told, right after October 7th, the attack in Israel. So his mind was consumed, according to aides. He was incredibly busy. And these interviews were for a long time. They were for 5 hours at a time. The president is there. He's walking to the podium. Let's listen in.
Let me say a few things before I take your questions. As you know, the special counsel released his findings today about their look into my handling of classified documents. I was pleased to see he reached a firm conclusion that no charges should be brought against me in this case. This was an exhaustive investigation going back more than 40 years, even into the 1970s when I was still a new United States Senator. The special counsel acknowledged I cooperated completely. I did not throw up any roadblocks. I sought no delays. In fact, I was so determined to give the special counsel what he needed, I went forward with a 5-hour in-person interview over 2 days on October the 8th and 9th of last year, even though Israel had just been attacked by Hamas on the 7th and I was very occupied. It was in the middle of handling an international crisis. I was especially pleased to see special counsel make clear the stark distinction and difference between this case and Mr. Trump's case. Special counsel wrote, and I quote, "Several material distinctions between Mr. Trump's case and Mr. Biden's are clear," continuing to quote, "Most notably, after given multiple chances to return classified documents to avoid prosecution, Mr. Trump allegedly did the opposite. According to the indictment, he not only refused to return the documents for many months, he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then to lie about it. In contrast, he went on to say Mr. Biden turned in classified documents to the National Archives and the Department of Justice, consented to the search of multiple locations, including his home, sat for a voluntary interview, and in other ways cooperated with the investigation," end of quote. I've seen the headlines since the report was released about my willful retention of documents. These assertions are not only misleading, they're just plain wrong. On page 215, if you had a chance, I know it's a thick document. On page 215, the report of the special counsel found the exact opposite. Here's what he wrote. "There is, in fact, a shortage of evidence that I willfully retained classified materials related to Afghanistan." On page 12, the special counsel also wrote for another documents, "The decision to decline criminal charges was straightforward. The evidence suggests that Mr. Biden did not willfully retain these documents. The evidence said I did not willfully retain these documents. In addition, I know there's some attention paid to some language in the report about my recollection of events. There's even reference that I don't remember when my son died. How in the hell dare he raise that? Frankly, when I was asked the question, I thought to myself, it wasn't any of their damn business. Let me tell you something. Some of you have commented, I wear since the day he died, every single day, the rosary he got from Our Lady of... Every Memorial Day, we hold a service remembering him, attended by friends and family and the people who loved him. I don't need anyone to remind me when he passed away or passed away. Simple truth is I sat for a 5-hour interview over 2 days of events going back 40 years. At the same time I was managing an international crisis, their task was to make a decision about whether to move forward with charges in this case. That's their decision to make. That's the counsel's decision to make. That's his job. And they decided not to move forward. For any extraneous commentary, they don't know what they're talking about. It has no place in this report. The bottom line is the matter is now closed. I'm going to continue what I've always focused on, my job of being President of the United States of America. Now, thank you, and I'll take some questions.
President Biden, something the special counsel said in his report is that one of the reasons you were not charged is because, in his description, you are a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory?
I'm well-meaning, and I'm an elderly man, and I know what the hell I'm doing. I've been president. I put this country back on its feet. I don't need his recommendation. It's
How
totally
bad is your memory, and can you continue as president?
My memory is so bad, I let you speak. That's
Your
my
memory has gotten worse, Mr. President.
My memory is not good. My memory is fine. My memory, take a look at what I've done since I become president. None of you thought I could pass any of the things I got passed. How'd that happen? You know, I guess I just forgot what was going on.
Mr. President.
Voters have concerns about your age. How are you going to assuage them? And do you fear that this report is only going to fuel further concerns about your age?
Only by some of you.
Mr. President,
You were clear about criminal liability today, but do you take responsibility for at least being careless with classified material?
I take responsibility for not having seen exactly what my staff was doing. It goes in and points out things that appeared in my garage, things that came out of my home, things that were moved not by me, but my staff.
Mr. President, for months when you were asked about your age, you would respond with the words, "Watch me." Many American people have been watching, and they have expressed concerns about your age.
That is your judgment. That is your judgment. That is not the judgment of the press.
They expressed concerns about your mental acuity. They say that you are too old. Mr. President, in December, you told me that you believe there are many other Democrats who could defeat Donald Trump. So why does it have to be you now? What is your answer
Because
to
I'm the
that
most
question?
qualified person in this country to be president of the United States and finish the job I started.
Do you believe that, guys? Mr. President, why are you confusing the names of world leaders?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
I did not share classified information. I did not share it.
With your ghostwriter.
With my ghostwriter, I did not. Guarantee you did not.
But the special counsel said in the
Well, no,
report
he
that he
did
did.
not say that.
Okay.
He did not say that.
But Mr. President, one of the...
Let me answer your question. The fact of the matter is, what I didn't want repeated, I didn't want him to know, and I didn't read it to him, was I had written a long memorandum to President Obama why we should not be in Afghanistan. And I was of multiple pages. And so what I was referring to, I said classified. I should have said should be private because it was a contact between the president and the vice president as to what was going on. That's what he was referring to. It was not classified information in that document. That was not classified.
He called on me. When you look back at this incident, is there anything you would do differently now? And do you think that a special prosecutor should have been appointed in the first place in both of these cases?
First of all, what I would have done is oversee the transfer of the material that was in my office, in my offices. I should have done that. If I go back, I didn't have the responsibility to do that. That was my staff was supposed to do that, and they referenced that in the report. And my staff did not do it in the way that, for example, I didn't know how half the boxes got in my garage until I found out staff gathered them up, put them together, and took them to the garage in my home. And all the stuff that was in my home was in filing cabinets that were either locked or able to be locked. It was in my house. It wasn't out in Mar-a-Lago in a public place and none of it was high classified. Didn't have any of that red stuff on it. You know what I mean? Around the corners? None of that. And so I wish I had paid more attention to how the documents were being moved and where. I thought they were being moved to the archives. I thought all of it was being moved. That's what I thought. Now, what was the last part of your question?
Whether a special counsel should have been appointed in this case and in the case of your rival president, former president?
I think a special counsel should have been appointed. And the reason I think a special counsel should have been appointed is because I did not want to be in a position that they looked at Trump and weren't going to look at me, just like they looked at the vice president. And the fact is they made a firm conclusion. I did not break the law, period. Thank you all very, very much.
We've just been listening to President Biden in the diplomatic room addressing the special counsel's findings of his mishandling of classified. Let's listen in. It sounds like
I'm of the view, as you know, that the conduct of the response in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, has been over the top. I think that, as you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate. I talked to Bibi to open the gate on the Israeli side. I've been pushing really hard to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza. There are a lot of innocent people who are starving, a lot of innocent people who are in trouble and dying, and it's got to stop, number one. Number two, I was also in the position that I'm the guy that made the case that we have to do much more to increase the amount of material going in, including fuel, including other items. I've been on the phone with the Qataris, I've been on the phone with the Egyptians, I've been on the phone with the Saudis to get as much aid as we possibly can into Gaza. There are innocent people, innocent women and children who are also in badly in need of help. And so that's what we're pushing. And I'm pushing very hard now to deal with this hostage ceasefire because, as I've been working tirelessly in this deal. How can I say this without revealing it? To lead to a sustained pause in the fighting, in the actions taking place in the Gaza Strip. And because I think if we could get the delay for that, an initial delay, I think that we would be able to extend that so that we could increase the prospect that this fighting in Gaza changes. There's also negotiations. You may recall, in the very beginning, right before Hamas attacked, I was in contact with the Saudis and others to work out a deal where they would recognize Israel's right to exist, make them part of the Middle East, and recognize them fully in return for certain things that the United States would commit to do. And the commitment that we were proposed to do related to two items. I'm not going to go in detail, but one of them was to deal with the protection against their arch enemy to the northwest, northeast, I should say. The second one, by providing ammunition and material for them to defend themselves. Coincidentally, that's the time frame when this broke out. I have no proof what I'm about to say, but it's not unreasonable to suspect that the Hamas understood what was about to take place and wanted to break it up before it happened.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, we've just been listening to President Biden there in the diplomatic room, at first addressing the special counsel's report on his mishandling of classified documents, addressing that, saying the special counsel decided not to charge and that essentially defending his own behavior. And then he addressed a little portion of his remarks were addressing the issues over his memory and whether he was still fit to be president. The president, of course, defending his own behavior, his own mental capacity, saying he is fit to be president. He's going to finish the job he started. Peter Alexander is our chief White House correspondent. He joins us live now on this special coverage. Peter, this was sort of quite the speech and then quite the Q&A with the White House press corps there. Afterwards, we should mention the president started to talk about Gaza, and he seemed to make a mistake talking about the president of Egypt, but saying Mexico. There was another portion in his remarks earlier where he forgot something else. Peter, the questions that were poised to him, I don't know if I've ever seen sort of rapid fire questions like this about his mental state, about his memory, but this seemed to me to be sort of a turning point in his presidency and a remarkable night, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think American voters can decide if this is going to be a turning point. We'll watch that going forward. Obviously, this was a dramatic day and not a good day for the president. While he was legally found that he's off the hook, there were no criminal charges that were warranted as determined by the special counsel here. Politically, I think the peril is very obvious, and it's one that's going to stick with this White House and goes right to the root of what is one of the biggest concerns and criticisms of Americans of the Biden presidency, of President Joe Biden himself, that at 81, he doesn't have the mental acuity, the fitness, and he's simply too old to serve as president for a second term. I was struck by the president's tone in his remarks. Clearly, he was angry. He was frustrated. He was very critical. As stinging as the assessment, 345 plus pages by the special counsel Robert Hur was today, it was equally blistering the president's criticism of Hur himself, saying in effect to the assessment that found in Hur's view that Joe Biden simply didn't remember a lot of things. His recall wasn't there, that he couldn't recall when his son, his beloved son, Beau, had died. The president was furious about that, really showing some anger there, saying that when that question was asked, he thought it was, excuse my language, it was the president's language, none of his damn business. Some of the toughest language in the document by the special counsel described Biden, President Biden, as being well-meaning, a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. The president said, "I'm well-meaning, I'm elderly, but I know what the hell I'm doing." He was asked by one of the reporters there, as he has noted in the past, that he believes there are other Democrats that could beat Donald Trump, why he believed he should be the presidential nominee on the Democratic side. Again, he says because he's the most prepared person in this country to be president of the United States and the best prepared to complete what he has already accomplished in office here. Tom, the bottom line for this White House is that this is a storyline that's not going to go away overnight. The president did try to make some clarifications that some of the headlines that come out of this about the willful retention of classified documents later in this large report, the special counsel appears to sort of couch those statements, saying as it relates to the Afghanistan documents that there isn't sufficient evidence to show willful retention of classified documents, but it does a couple of things. One, what you note is that the same way that the indictments of Donald Trump for his mishandling, as it was, as alleged by the special counsel of classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, has become basically, all these indictments have become advantageous for him, certainly in the primary. Here you have the president of the United States who has found that there are no charges necessary. There was no crime committed, and yet this is a major disadvantage. This is a real problem for him because it does get to the root of that of that defining issue for a lot of Americans as it relates to this president. I was struck that he stayed in the room initially as long as he did, and then that he didn't stay longer, frankly. I can only imagine the expressions of staff that were gathered with him. But at moments like this, Tom, I think the White House's impression, having spoken to aides there over the course of the day, was when this comes out, we want to address it and we want to get all the questions and all the answers out immediately to try to sort of blunt this stinging assessment before it drags on for days. I don't know that they're going to be able to do that clearly. I think that was initially the desire here, but there still are obviously a lot of questions to be answered and a lot of Americans who are going to be learning about this and asking their own questions over the course of the next several days, weeks, and who knows, months.
And Peter, we were talking with Ali Rafa earlier about this. The president already addressed the special counsel's report earlier tonight, and then suddenly the White House announces that the president's going to make remarks tonight. And Ali was pointing out how highly unusual this is for the president, for the White House. Do you think sort of the avalanche of bad news coming out politically from everywhere, right? And most of the headlines are the same, legally exonerated, a political nightmare. Do you think it's because of the political fallout that the president decided to address the nation tonight?
I think to the point I was making before, this wasn't, he addressed the nation. We took it live as we're watching it right now. This is not like this was an Oval Office address. Right. The president made remarks earlier to Democrats. A lot of it wasn't seen by Americans. They knew this was a big issue. They wanted the president to be out front about it, to be transparent. That's why after the White House the White House counsel's office and the president's personal lawyers had their own opportunity this week, Tom, to review the entire Hur report, the entire special counsel report, that they effectively declined any executive privilege there. They said, put it all out there. They recognized how it would be politically impactful and damaging to them. But I think a lot of the language that you hear when you speak to those in the Justice Department communities, that was a bit gratuitous, they feel. Certainly the president's allies, his defenders, his lawyers, the counsel's office have said a lot of this information, a lot of the way this was detailed was, in their words, inappropriate, gratuitous, as many of them described it to me over the course of the last couple of hours here. Because at the end of the day, really, it was the special counsel's job not to make any assessments about Joe Biden's memory issues or what struck him, but just say whether this guy should be charged with any crimes here or he had any criminal liability under the circumstances here. So I think that's going to be a lingering anger and frustration. It's reminiscent of what happened with James Comey several years ago when he made his highly publicized comments about Hillary Clinton and sort of put, as the Democrats described it, spin on the ball, saying that no charges, that she hadn't done anything that warranted charges, but that she was effectively sloppy in her handling of classified information. That was a political dagger if it wasn't a legal one for Hillary Clinton at the time.
Peter, are the criticisms over the memory issues and highlighting some of the missteps earlier this week and then just now with the president of Mexico and Gaza, have those gotten worse over the last year or so, or has it kind of been the same criticism since he's taken office?
It's a good question. Certainly, you're referring to some comments this week, just in the last couple of days. He referred to Francois Mitterrand, the former president of France, who passed away almost 30 years ago. He meant to be referring to President Macron of France just yesterday. He was referring to the Chancellor Angela Merkel, but he referred to Helmut Kohl instead, who served as chancellor many years earlier. So it's those moments that I think in this sort of climate get amplified. I will note, and Democrats have pinged me to say just as much over the course of the day. You look at Donald Trump, who's only a few years younger than Joe Biden here, and Donald Trump criticized Nikki Haley as she was quick to attack him on blaming Nancy Pelosi, or saying that Nikki Haley was the one who was in charge of the Capitol during January 6th. As Haley said, I was nowhere near the Capitol on January 6th. That was Nancy Pelosi at the time, right? So Americans are going to have to make their own assessments about all of that. I've covered the last three presidents. I've certainly heard misspoken words by all of them. For Joe Biden, certainly it gets a lot more attention. We focus on it, I think, a lot more. But I'm really not in a position to say that his memory appears to be better or worse than it was when I first, started covering this presidency. He certainly doesn't have perhaps the same physical vigor that he had when I covered him as a vice president here. But as he said, look at the things that I've accomplished. And I think at the end of the day, what his challenge will be is to focus on those key issues, on the things he has accomplished and the things he believes he's best suited to accomplish going forward, and to try to convince Americans that makes him best positioned to be the president for another 4 years.
Peter, we've been told that aides have said that it wouldn't be a surprise if he does not debate in the general election. We know there's going to be no Super Bowl interview. It's been, I think this last sit-down interview was back in October. My question to you is, do we know what the re-election campaign from here on out to November is going to look like? What can voters who are Democrats who are excited about President Biden, what can they expect to see from the president?
I think you're going to see him on the road a lot more. We're already witnessing that. I was talking to some top aides today about how the president is trying to do some smaller events where it gives him some interactions with individuals. He did as much in North Carolina, did it in Michigan, did it in Pennsylvania as well, that allows him to engage directly with Americans. But at the end of the day, most Americans aren't going to get to have face-to-face time with this president. I think it's going to be incumbent on this White House, this campaign, to put the president out as often as possible, to hear him speak, to hear the way he conducts himself, and to watch him. He has said to us repeatedly when there have been questions about his age in the past, watch me. One of the reporters in that room asked a question that he took some offense to or some umbrage to, where she basically said, polls show that people have watched you and they think you don't have the mental acuity for the job. He pushed back on that. But at the end of the day, you do. You have to watch him work and see him more frequently, I think, in the eyes of a lot of Americans right now. And so I think this headline does sort of add to the urgency and the necessity that the campaign do as much. You're going to see a lot of him. He's going to try to make the points as best he can about all these key issues on policy. And at the end of the day, a lot of people, I think, will focus as much on just the president they see in person and then have to balance that with their views on policy.
Peter, we talk about a lot about voters and viewers' memories, and we live in such a fast sort of news cycle that things come and things go, and you move on to the next thing, especially in this world with so much technology. And I bring this up because there's still 270 days before Election Day. There's a crisis at the border. We're dealing with 2 wars overseas. The economy, new reports showing consumer sentiment. People are getting more positive about the economy. Essentially, there's a lot going on. Do you think this problem right now, the issues with the memory, the issues with his mental clarity, does this stick, or can he overcome this and move on?
Well, he's going to need to overcome it to move on. I think the issue of his age and, in the eyes of some, his mental acuity is definitively going to be there through the remainder of this campaign. For as long as Joe Biden is a candidate for president of the United States or is president, that is going to be a heavy focus. And this is only underscoring the focus it is going to get in the course of the months going forward. You talk about 270 plus days until the election. Tom, just back up and think about all that's happened in the last not even 270 days. There was no war in Israel, the fighting between Israel and Hamas. Just a matter of days ago, this White House felt like it was on offense. It had a cudgel, a political sort of hammer to attack Republicans, because the same Republicans who had said, hey, before we want to deal with Ukraine and Israel, the President Biden was calling for more aid to be directed to those countries. They were saying you need to handle the border first. So they put Democrats and Republicans, a conservative Republican, a former preacher from Oklahoma, James Langford, behind closed doors with those Democrats. They came up with what is widely, Mitch McConnell among those, saying the most progress in terms of cracking down on illegal migration to this country in decades. And then the Republicans, at the urging of Donald Trump, backed away from it. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't support this. In effect, Donald Trump wants this to be a political issue, the Democrats argue, trying to weaponize the border as a problem, and doesn't want to see any correction to the issues there because that wouldn't serve his purposes going forward, right? So that was just in the course of not even a week, Tom. So we got a long way to go in terms of what other issues may come to the fore, to say nothing of the 91 charges against former President Trump. He has a series of potential trials ahead, most notably, we know his name's going to be on the ballot, as it appeared. The Supreme Court justices indicated today, and they're still to be determined, still to be pronounced ruling as it relates to Colorado. But you got the D.C. election interference case. There are a lot of twists and turns to go. But in the simplest of terms, the issue of age, it will remain an issue for the remainder of this campaign.
Peter Alexander, we appreciate all your help with this and all your reporting tonight. I want to go back to Ali Rafa. She's had a chance to check in with her sources and listen to that speech. Ali, your first thoughts. We were talking just before the president took to the podium. Tell me what you've learned tonight.
Yeah, Tom. Well, I thought it was very notable that the president, as you saw, walking away, taking just a few steps away from the podium, and was then asked about the hostage negotiations to get those hostages out of Gaza that are being held by Hamas. The president talking about those negotiations and Israel's response to Hamas, calling it over the top. And then in a very poorly timed gaffe, saying that he referred to President El-Sisi of Egypt as the president of Mexico when referring to efforts to get more humanitarian aid through the Rafah border crossing into Gaza. And that, Tom, is the main concern of this White House, as we know that those concerns are growing, those concerns that have been there really for years now. I covered the president's 2020 campaign and those issues and those concerns about his age, about his mental fitness. Those concerns existed even before the president was elected in 2020. And that is exactly what the White House is trying to reassure voters to not have those concerns. That is proving to be a very difficult task for this White House. As we know, the election is 270 days away now, and we can just bet that the Biden campaign is hoping that voters can have some shift of attention between now and then. But what I can tell you is certain is the former president and his campaign are going to try as hard as possible to keep this news and keep today's report by the special counsel in the headlines and continue weaponizing that and using it against the president, Tom.
It's definitely a new phase of this campaign. It's a new phase of the president's White House, his time in the White House. It's something he's going to have to address and discuss, and it's likely not over right now, along with him dealing with everything else we've been talking about: 2 wars overseas, the crisis at the border, and the economy. Ali, we appreciate all your reporting tonight. We thank you for that. This has been a special coverage of President Biden's remarks following that scathing special counsel report. We thank you for watching Top Story tonight in this special report. Gadi Schwartz has the latest right now.